hear about tackling inequality from Silviya Barrett. In a few moments, we're going to hear about supporting freight while reducing its environmental impact by Andrew Gough. But first, where is he? Here we go. Let me introduce Dr. Scott Copsey, Smart Mobility Research Unit Director from the University of Hertfordshire, who is going to tell us all about rural connectivity. Scott.
Lovely, thanks very much. I assume my slides are going to appear by magic, I hope, and if not, perfect, there we go. Thank you very much, and I think just about good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Scott Copsey. I'm a lecturer at the university, but my background is as a professional transport planner, and in the last 3 years I've been asked to set up a research unit around my professional background on transport, which we've called the Smart Mobility Unit, and it's about linking my professional background in transport planning with students, so going back into the classroom and bringing people and students into transport planning. So that's something that we've evolved. I also lead the Geography and Environment program at undergraduate level, and I'm very pleased to announce that we're about to launch a new Masters in Transport Planning in January, which will also link students with, hopefully, employment. We're offering an advanced research profile route and also with placements. So, first slide, can you go on to the next one? Is everyone going to press my buttons or? Perfect. Okay. Wonderful. Technology, eh? I run the Smart Mobility Unit. I can't please press a button. So, very quickly, the background to this work was, as a university transport planner, we have all the issues that we've been debating here. So about 2 years ago, we started to say, can we actually deliver smart, sustainable, environmentally friendly transport in rural areas? The University of Hertfordshire, in the south of the Heartland, is effectively surrounded by lots of field, very wealthy. So it's very car dependent. We have lots of people who own more than one car, and they travel around their cars. And they do that because the world they've been basically born into is based around the car. So they don't think they've got any options. So we need to think about the difference. So Hertfordshire, read the Heartland, read lots of areas around the world where people actually, they don't all live in cities. They live in rural areas or in medium-sized market towns, and they have to move between those market towns. So traffic congestion, there we go. It's already like a car park. It's only going to get worse, okay? Air pollution, a key thing. These are some of the themes that have evolved from these discussions. If we electrify our cars, okay, that might be a good thing, but around about 50% of emissions come from brakes. So actually, we're not solving the problems related to health-related issues from brakes. The next speaker, I think, is going to talk a little bit about social isolations, but part of our discussion, particularly from students, is actually they don't want to own cars. They want to use a car, but they can't afford cars. They can't actually afford housing as well. So there's another link between where we're building houses and actually excluding people from actually buying those houses, and also forcing them to buy cars. So this car dependence is causing issues for marginal groups. Students are among them, and we hear this in the classroom. Surprise, surprise, climate change, the elephant in the room. Can we keep living the way we are, using the cars, buying the cars we have, and actually reduce carbon emissions? We all know transport now, in the UK at least, emits more carbon as a sector than anyone else. So, as part of this discussion, we set up a discussion around these roundtables where we invited industry, local authorities, government, so Department of Transport, academics, we had students involved in there, and we started to say, actually, what are the things they wanted to see? So these are some of the examples. There'll be no surprise. In terms of actually delivering transport in rural areas, well, surprise, surprise, we need to use much better public transport. We as a university own and operate our own bus company. We've done transport planning for the last 30 years called UNO. We have some electric buses. We have some demand responsive transport as part of that fleet. But increasingly, all the things we would want, they need to be more frequent, integrated, potentially linking with trams. So in Hertfordshire at least, we're looking at mass rapid transport, and we'd want to say, how do we link these new systems in with existing systems to do all the things we want, which is make better integrated services. We're going to have to think about paying for transport differently. We've already touched on this for the electrification of cars. We are probably going to have to pay by mile, because we're not going to be paying by fuel. That could be a really big thing. That would be the thing that transforms all our behaviour. We've seen COVID. This discussion started just before COVID, where we're saying, how are we going to have to make this shift? Well, COVID has seen that we can make that shift. We've made the shift back quite quickly, haven't we? If we actually have to pay for the miles we use when we use them in peak times, we can change, we don't have to keep building all these roads. So that was a quick thing, paying for transport differently. 15-minute neighbourhoods. We go back to car dependence. If we actually build our neighbourhoods, and we have to think about the ones we've already built, if we actually provide the services like health, shops, schools, all the usual things where we can walk and cycle in 15 minutes, we can actually work maybe 150 miles away like I do from my work. I've delivered lectures for the last 18 months to students. We don't actually always have to be in the same place. We've seen that that works. So 15-minute neighbourhoods are something that we need to think about in terms of land use planning and building out car dependence. We've talked about sometimes they're called mobility hubs, community hubs. Actually, can you provide technology solutions in local areas, which includes mobility, but also other services, shared mobility options, particularly for students? We think a university campus is a great example of a community hub where you can provide cars, electric cars, e-scooters as a ready, I suppose, procurable service through phones or whatever it might be, instead of actually people having to buy their cars. Remember, cars, 97%, I'd argue in COVID, nearly 100%, are sat there doing nothing all the time. And then we obviously have to think about other services, so things like high-quality cycle lanes, places across the county that take you into town, into local centres, and certainly we're working with our own local authority in Hertfordshire on these kind of things. And then we also need to think about local freight. Freight is obviously a big issue in the news at the moment, but what about the use of electric vans and cargo bikes, links to stations and things like this? These are all the themes that we're working to in terms of bringing this into teaching students, teaching the next generation of planners and transport planners, and it's that document which we will be launched in the next couple of weeks in partnership with the Heartland. Thank you very much for helping to sponsor that, which actually builds on some of these issues. But actually, we can do things now. These are the things we want to debate. Plan new homes in the right places with good transport, not just public transport, with cycling routes and walking. Bike hire schemes, electric. A shout out for Watford. We have one in Watford, already has one. Community hubs. Pilot these. We're starting to think about piloting these in Hertfordshire, so in market towns. We're exploring a living lab, which is a part of a digital twin, and the university is actually going to be based on this digital twin. So what a great example. We can actually say to students, come and learn how to do sustainable transport in Hertfordshire using things such as living labs in the places where people live and reside, and we can look at all these different impacts in terms of e-bike, e-scooters. We need to plan better bus services. We've got our own bus company. We work closely with them. Our own bus company is working with Hertfordshire County Council. We've just implemented a demand responsive services in a rural area. So it's already tackling these things called in rural areas. So Hearts Link. And there's a quick flyer. Lots of issues in there for 5 minutes. Have I stuck to my 5 minutes, Anthony? Perfect. Okay.
Applause. Thanks, Scott. We'll come back to you. Let me grab my book.
Perfect.
Right. As a quick romp through rural connectivity, let's move on now to Dr. Andrew Gough, Freight and Logistics Policy Group at the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, supporting freight while reducing its environmental impact. How are we going to do that, Andrew?
How are we going to do that? Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'm here with my hat on for the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. My name is Andrew Gough. I'm also an academic. I'm at the University of Northampton, but my prior background is as a strategy director for UPS. So hopefully I can give you some of the insights of the way that we actually think about capability going forward. This picture that I've got on the screen at the moment showing a fully functioning port is obviously something that we would love to have once again. And that is actually one of my points, because you tend to get drawn into the here and now. And you know, what do you see when you look at a graph like that? You see a plunge from pandemic, and then everything pitching back again. If Nick, your increase in LGV traffic, if you put in a bit of a change of fleet, can't get an HGV driver, get 2 LGV drivers instead, that 4% bounce back is actually your 7% extra vehicles on the road. The trouble is that as a strategist, it's the boring bits you need to look at. It's the constant growth that came before the pandemic and the constant growth that is actually seen post-pandemic. A properly functioning UK economy grows around 1.5–2% per annum. The World Bank established way back in the 1980s that the elasticity of road freight activity against GDP is essentially 1. If you increase GDP by 1%, you increase road freight activity by 1%. The industry here in the Heartland is around about 8 to 10% of gross value added, I would suggest. Probably greater here in Northamptonshire. I'm going to claim this circuit as Northampton, at least most of it anyway. Every modelled scenario sees an increase in freight activity compared to the pre-pandemic baseline. So I'm not remotely surprised by the observations from national highways. The potential of rail freight is high, but the planning processes are very slow. And the key thing is they're not decided locally. Larger projects, strategic rail freight initiatives, fall under the National Strategic Infrastructure Project rules. They're decided nationally. Now we've got some easy actions that we can take. We actually know what we're doing, I would suggest, with first and last mile freight solutions. Cargo bikes, well understood. DHL, for example, in the Netherlands uses them extensively. Electric vans, well understood. Recharging infrastructure, demands well understood. Where the technologies are known, the normal vehicle replacement cycles can step in. It then becomes a question of refueling and recharging infrastructure. Long distance road freight, on the other hand, we need technological certainty. We very much welcome the extended trials that are taking place, the catenary trial on the M180, the trials of hydrogen vehicles, looking very closely at the DFDS initiative in the US with long-distance electric trucks. But until the technology is known, industry faces a risk. If that risk can be transferred, and this is something that the UK of any country knows full well from the investment in vaccine development, if the risk can be transferred, industry can move very, very, very quickly indeed. So I was asked to look at wicked problems. England's economic heartland has one wicked problem that is far and away ahead of all of the others: success. Because success in the heartland will attract freight activity in the short term and in the long term. Doesn't matter what you're doing, whether you're looking at housing, whether you're looking at employment, even the development and construction itself will all generate freight demand. The key is getting your spatial allocation right. If you give room for freight as a priority, noting that the use of that space might change over time, you have a strategy for minimizing the disbenefits of your own success. So whether we're looking at construction consolidation centers in the near term, whether we're looking at identifying rail-connected sites in the near to medium term, choose wisely. Because those sites can then evolve with you, work with you, grow into the urban consolidation centres, the employment centres that you crave. And if you get the chance to participate in any of these trials that reduce the technological uncertainty of freight solutions, please take them, step up, because the industry will thank you for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Right, we'll come back to Andrew with the questions a bit later on, but first, Silviya Barrett. Welcome, Silviya. Head of Policy Research and Projects for the Campaign for Better Transport. Tackling equality in transport. How are we going to solve that wicked problem?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a tricky one. For those of us that don't know us, Campaign for Better Transport is the national charity for promoting sustainable, greener, fairer transport solutions. And why we do that? Because many disadvantaged groups are by definition more reliant on public transport, on walking and cycling, and that makes the provision of those options a social justice issue. I've got just a few slides to illustrate this. Oh, these got squeezed. Yes, that's data that shows that car availability squeezes with income. And yeah, sorry, they didn't look like that on my slides, but basically the green is the proportion of households that do not have access to private cars, and it's 45% of households among the lowest income groups, as opposed to 14% in the highest income groups. So basically, car availability rises with income. If we look at trips made by income level, people on higher incomes also use their cars much more. So that's the green bars, that's car use, as opposed to people on lower incomes who tend to use the bus, and that's the yellow bar at the top, or to walk and cycle, that's the green bars at the bottom, much more than people on higher incomes. The other thing that we can see is that people on higher incomes also tend to make more trips overall, as opposed to people on lower incomes, and that really poses a question about access to services, access to opportunity, and the fact that people on higher incomes might be more able to do that. There's also lots of research to show that disadvantaged groups, including people on lower incomes, but also disabled people, older people, or younger people, and ethnic minorities, are much more disproportionately affected by the negative impacts of car use. So that includes the impacts of air pollution, the health impacts of that, road danger, carbon emissions and the impact of climate change, but also public realm and the provision of green space. So all these negative impacts much more disproportionately affect disadvantaged groups. And we did some research on transport connectivity in left-behind neighborhoods. The way we defined that was we identified 225 already deprived communities, so in the bottom 10% on the multiple deprivation index, but also ones that are suffering from poor social transport connectivity and social infrastructure as well. And what we found was that, so the dark dots on the map represent where these left-behind communities are. And you can see lots of clusters in the northeast, in the West Midlands and so on. And what we found was that 84% of those left-behind neighborhoods have worse connectivity on average than the England average of sort of wards. So the analysis was done at the ward level. And while these were predominantly in sort of statistically classed as urban areas, the clusters of left-behind neighborhoods that had specifically poor public transport were in those more remote and less populous areas. And we found that the lack of connectivity really adds to that disadvantage that people are already facing in those areas. So not only do they have lower car ownership, like like other disadvantaged neighborhoods, so 40% versus 26% on average, but also they had poorer public transport links. And that means that it takes longer to travel by public transport, by walking and cycling, to places of employment, places of vital services like hospitals and employment centers and so on. And that affects people's access to employment. So 24% of households in left-behind neighborhoods are out of work and have no access to a car, and that's double the average across England. Why is that? So over time, authorities with left-behind neighborhoods in them have seen bus use decline much faster than authorities outside that don't have left-behind neighborhoods. So even though public transport links and bus journeys have been cut and bus provision, people are still more reliant on buses when they are there. In addition to the bus service cuts, there have also been the rail connectivity issues, so the beaching cuts still affect people, and the lack of rail connectivity is obviously adding to the poorer public transport networks conundrum in those areas. That's just an illustration of the areas in the area we're talking about. So while there isn't a big cluster in England's economic heartland areas, unlike, for example, the Essex coast or the Northeast and Northumberland, County Durham, there are big clusters in those areas of left-behind neighbourhoods with poor connectivity. But there are still sort of a handful of areas in here that are impacted by poor public transport connectivity. So places like Northampton, Fenton and Corby, that's just a map of some of those areas. What do we think should be done about that? Obviously, we're advocating for much greater investment from the government to improve public transport infrastructure. We're calling on multi-year spending commitments in the spending review. To invest in local buses. We're calling on rail reopenings and investment in rail in order to boost that local connectivity, as well as supporting local authorities to identify where those gaps are, to apply for the relevant funding. Because research that we've done for the Department of Transport shows that many local authorities are suffering from poor capacity themselves, so small teams and lack of resources to invest and plan for the future. So supporting communities and supporting local authorities to identify those gaps and then invest in linking those public transport links. Thank you.
I'm going to now introduce our Heartland Stakeholder Panel. James Golden-Graham. James, where are you? James, where are you? James, you're there. James, you gather around the microphone here, and also Roz Bird, Silverstone Technology Cluster Board. Where's Roz? Welcome, Roz. Phil Southall. Phil, you're there. And also, who is Managing Director of Oxford Bus Company. And Lucy Ellis, Section Engineer from East West Rail Phase 2. Right, we got gather round. Come up onto the stage. Come on. Come and join me up here.
Don't be shy.
Now, this is your microphone here, so just gather around here. Now, the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to ask each of our panel, our Heartland Stakeholder Panel members, 3 questions. 2 first of all, and I'm going to come to the third, okay? So I want your really quick responses to the first 2, which is what jumped out of you about what you heard? What surprised you most? Okay, those are the first 2. Stay with me. The third one I want you to get stuck into is, what do you want to hear more about from these folks here? So that's when you're going to put them on the spot and really challenge them what you want to hear more about. So, James, what surprised you? What jumped out of you?
Okay, so I'll start with the surprise. I think I was really interested to hear about the lack of certainty in technology in terms of how HGV and our operators are operating, particularly in terms of decarbonisation, but also really excited to hear of the confidence that you have in their ability to change quickly if that certainty is provided. Yep. I thought that was a really positive thing. I was quite also surprised not to hear any mention of the fact that we've got about circa 30% of the vehicles in our region running empty at any one time, and perhaps wanting to hear more about how we can address some of that.
Okay. Phil, what about you? What surprised you? What jumped out at you? I'll come back to you, James. You've got other things to mention.
Yeah, 2 things for me, really. The fact that public transport is a solution to a lot of our problems, I think, jumped out. Everybody's speaking positively about it. We need to have a really hard debate about how we perhaps turn a lot of the ambition that's been spoken about into reality, because me as a bus operator is dealing with this absolutely every day, trying to get the roads clear so we can run our services punctually and on time. But the fact that we're talking positively about public transport, I'm seeing as a really positive thing that jumped out. As was really the need to tax motorists differently. That was a fantastic point that Scott made. You know, the elephant in the room is that the government is facing a £40 billion black hole in its finances as we electrify and decarbonise cars, buses and everything else. And that gap needs to be filled somehow. My view is that road pricing or some form of it is inevitable. So if it is inevitable, why aren't we cracking on with trying to do it and setting a national framework for these guys locally and us as bus operators to actually know where we stand and to make plans for the future? So I think those are the 2 things for me.
Buses are the solutions. It came from the Bus Operators Association. Lucy, what about you?
I think something that pleasantly surprised me is how that we're addressing from a young people's perspective the identification of different courses that need to be run at universities, so the town and country planning, how we're developing new masters, but something that still sticks out is how the interconnectivity between rail and bus routes or car journeys is still a problem, because that's not a new problem. It's been a problem over decades. It's been something that particularly during station development, we've tried to address time and time again, and it's something I'd like to touch on with yourself a bit later.
Okay, and Roz, finally, what really leapt out for you?
Yeah, sure. I've just made some notes to make it succinct. So I suppose for me, what's jumped out on the whole morning, including the last two apart from Silvia, is the lack of discussion about the customer and the fact that, you know, the end user, the customer, who this is all for, why we need this improvement in system. We need to start with the customer. They're the electorate. We need solutions. We need data to motivate us. I guess at Silverstone Park, I'm sort of an end user, business representative. So slightly on the other side with thinking, you know, how do we motivate people, give them informed choices about their carbon footprint, and you know, create that integrated transport set of options that people need. And I don't think I've heard much about that yet today.
Okay. What do you? So you want to hear more? Scott, talk about that end user. Respond to Roz's point about the end user and making sure that they're really up front and central.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we've, going into a classroom and relaying the different things that we all talk about, you suddenly realise how complex transport delivery is. There's no easy solution. But one of the things I always said was, generally students in our classrooms are under 25, not always, we have mature students as well. But that was one of our key themes, is actually, why aren't we talking to the users in a classroom? We're saying, actually, do you want to buy a car? No, we can't afford one, actually. So why are we still planning for an infrastructure for basically it's for the motor car, for a generation coming up which is going to be voting in politicians, and I think we're starting to see a shift in that now, away from actually why do you keep building more roads? Why do we keep investing on roads? I'm not saying roads are bad, by the way, they're still part of the future, the car will still be part of the future. I'm not anti-car, by the way. It's the way we use them we need to change them. But actually, what about the social exclusion for the groups who can't use the car? Why aren't we planning railway stations that can't?
Well, let's ask Lucy. You mentioned the fact you're part of the youth movement. Do you want to buy a car? Do you agree with that? Is that right? Go to the mic, otherwise you won't be heard.
Because I live in a rural area, my use of car is quite high. So my answer there is yes, I do use a car and I do like earning a car. Should there be a public transport that has good interconnectivity to the places that I generally go to, not necessarily the places they currently offer, then I might be swayed. But at the minute, that's probably why my answer is like that.
So what do you want to hear more from Silvia about this kind of boosting equality then, from your perspective?
So from my perspective, on East West Rail Phase 2, which is the project that I'm currently on, in the early design phases, we held a series of workshops with minority groups, whether that be ethnic minorities, disabilities, marriage, the whole group, to really try and identify different design and construction techniques that we could utilise that benefit those minority groups. Why isn't that being done on further projects on any size? And how would you like different projects to be delivered in the future with those minority groups in mind?
Silvia?
I think just one thing to note, first of all, is that, I mean, we're not, we're aware that people will be relying on cars for some time, and lots of people rely on cars. So we're definitely supportive of fleet electrification, of the shift towards zero-emission vehicles. But also, yes, you said that there's lots of people that don't own cars, that they are reliant on those networks. So investing in those, preserving them, the pandemic has really affected public transport services and the way that these are delivered. So we're asking government to make sure that they're preserved, so that they're enhanced over the long term, and that people are more able to use them in future. But on specific public transport projects, I think local authorities can be quite poor at sort of having meaningful community engagement. So especially with the bus service improvement plans, what we've seen in the first round is local authorities sending just short surveys to their residents, as opposed to actually engaging those people in left behind areas, the people that actually suffer from poor connectivity, identifying where the gaps are, how can the system, public transport system work better, how it can be better integrated. We've heard from lots of people that don't have bus services in the evenings or at weekends, and they don't have a way of making those journeys, you know, unless they get on the bus by 5 o'clock, you know, they'll be stranded. So it's identifying those transport deserts, as we call them, and filling those gaps.
More questions from the panel. What else you want? Roz, you look like you've got a burning point you want to make there.
I was just going to respond in going on to that sort of what surprised you the most was the point that was made in the earlier presentation about freight being the driver of investment in the strategic road network, not cars. So on that basis, and with young people in mind, and the fact that a lot of people want a better integrated transport system, surely we can continue to invest in roads for the sake of logistics and support the economy in the way just described. And at the same time, we need to get this integrated network sorted, the public transport, the mass rapid transit, and that would help support the levelling up agenda.
Andrew?
And that's the case we need to make.
Andrew.
Well, I mean, Roz, yes, thank you very much. I'd like to pick up on your question about customers. All logistics companies are focused on their customers. There's basically two principles that they run by: value on the customer's perspective, efficiency and effectiveness. So you're managing your resources, but you're giving the customer what they want. If the customer wants to move to a fulfillment model where they want to move away from a network which has 120 large shops all around the country, wants to move to a scenario where you're delivering 25,000 parcels to customers who didn't deliver yesterday, then those vehicles are going to need some way of going to the customer. And whether the vehicle is decarbonised or not, it still takes up road space. Road speeds aren't really going to change very much, the functions of congestion. So it's a competition for the same space. That's why my presentation was around spatial allocations. So do you need to invest in the roads? Yes, you do. You do need to invest in the roads, but you need to recognise that it is actually being driven by the user. The user themselves actually wants to do that. So the behavioural side of things, pushing click and collect, for example, looking at regional hubs, locker solutions, all these kind of things. These are all things that can actually sort of re-aggregate traffic that has actually been disaggregated by changing customer behaviour from the very beginning.
Panel, more points?
I mean, in terms of what do we want to know more about, this as was alluded to earlier on, it's easy to say that we want to decarbonise, but the scale of the challenge, I think, is still not recognised. So just looking at buses, if we are to go completely zero emission by 2035, we need £550 million every year between now and 2035. That's over £8 billion just for buses. Set against the road building programme of £27 billion, you then say, well, what's the priority? We know if you build more roads, you get more traffic on the roads, you get more congestion, more pollution. It's a vicious circle. So we as an industry believe that 8.25 billion, when set against 27 billion, is a small ask. But government at the moment only offered 120 million as a one-off competition for Zebra. So the challenge that I want to hear more about is how is government going to join this up in policy terms to achieve the outcomes that they need to achieve? Because at the moment it's riddled, and with respect to Nick from National Highways, when we're looking to put a bus lane on the A34, we can't put a bus lane on the A34 because there's not a hope in hell of getting one unless you can demonstrate a positive benefit for general traffic. So the tools that government's using to assess what do we need to do in terms of climate change are completely not fit for purpose with the climate emergency that we have. And I think, I do feel sorry for these three people because I think government needs to step in and set a much stronger national framework because that gives local authorities more ability to make the bold decisions that we need to remove traffic from our towns and cities.
Sylvia, is he right to feel sorry for you?
Well, yeah, I definitely agree with what's just been said. So the scale of investment in roads as opposed to public transport is just not right. And I had a question actually about what proportion of that risk fund is actually invested in improving roads, reallocating space to buses, to coaches, to walking and cycling, as opposed to expanding capacity, which just generates more traffic. And yes, freight does require road capacity, but there's lots of private car use on the strategic road network, on local roads. And there's lots of research out there to show that we will not reach net zero unless we have some of that behavior change away from private car towards sustainable modes. And the way to do that is through sticks and carrots. So you can do that at the national level through road pricing and a shift and a big investment in public transport, but at the local and subnational level through road space reallocation, parking schemes and charges, and recalibrating those away from the private car and boosting that provision of walking cycling infrastructure.
Andrew, and Scott.
Yeah, If I may, this is one of these moments when you wish you had one of your other slides handy, but I want to pick up on that point about technology and technology certainty and things like that. I want to actually make the case that industry is quite capable of moving in the right direction, has been doing so for many years. So if that screen behind our illustrious questioners here were a graph, and this was nitrogen oxides going that way, and that was particulate matter going that way, then that screen would represent a pre-Euro truck. Okay, so before the regulations came in about tailpipe emissions, you would have that much nitrogen oxide, that much particulate matter. That, lost it, is the, that is the size of a mobile phone, is the current properly maintained Euro 6. And all of that change has taken place in the industry simply by being driven along by regulation, which has a role, and the normal vehicle replenishment cycle. If you want that last bit to go, give us certainty which technology we need to be looking at.
Okay.
Because if you put a big battery into the back of a current truck, I need more trucks. Because I need more trucks because I haven't got the same payload. If I've got hydrogen in it, I need a refueling, recharging infrastructure. I've got to have certainty that I can get somewhere, refuel, come back. Right? I need a solution that works. If I have a solution that works, history from the 1980s onwards will show you that the industry will respond and will move in the right direction. We know our place in society.
Scott?
Yeah, I was going to finish with a P, if that's all right. Politics. I'm looking around the table and seeing local politicians and, I suppose, Member of Parliament. Ultimately, we need strong leadership. Okay, we are in an emergency. People might not think we're in an emergency, and if I had my colleague from the university who talks about glaciers, he goes up, researches glaciers, they are melting very quickly, you know, and ultimately, transport as a sector is now, in the UK, the biggest emitter, so about a third of it. And we're all going to have to change them. We talk about behaviour, Silviya talked about behaviour. We all of us, including myself, by the way, I'm a hypocrite as much as anyone else, we all need to change our behaviour. I will lecture to students, they know the emergency, we have the figures, we have the graphs, and then I said, who's going to fly off, in normal circumstances, to the Mediterranean in a couple of weeks? And they'll put their hands up. I said, are you going to change your behaviour? No. Now, if we really think we're going to carry on like we are, then we're in trouble, you know, and that's ultimately the big picture that we need to think about. And we have to think about all these issues, you know, the type of fuel, how we move around, the things we buy. And ultimately, we've all been born into a system where we are, the car has made us who we are, and we're all dependent on it. And we need to somehow find ways to actually get ourselves off this, this route, if we actually think it's serious. If not, we carry on doing what we do.
Are you liking what you're hearing over here?
Yes.
James,
I
what do you
can add one
think?
quick point to
Yeah,
this
go very quick,
on
very quick.
pricing. So we recently did a race between London and Glasgow, the COP26 venue, between plane and train. There's basically the perception that plane is so much faster. But actually the plane was 4 times cheaper to take in that instance than to travel by train. And actually we arrived in Glasgow at exactly the same time, 2 minutes apart. So until it's cheaper to use the train and to use greener modes, we've got no hope of people making the right choices. So we've got a big campaign today on freezing rail fares for next year, but having that big reform on fare structure and fare levels going forward.
Back to Scott's road user charging. James, have you got some points you want to make?
Yes, thank you. It's just a very brief one. Everything I'm reading about climate at the moment is pointing to the fact that we've got to the end of the decade, effectively, to significantly reduce the amount of carbon that we're emitting. Otherwise, we're locked into 1.5 degrees of warming, after which we're into the kind of the unknown. And just a little plug, really, is the fact that EEH are in the process of developing our own trajectories for each one of our local authorities to support the decision-making that our speakers today are all talking about to decarbonise our places. So yes, very positive to hear that the ideas are coming forward.
Do you want to hear more about anything? Roz, you want to hear more about something?
What I wanted to know about was how we could work together, business community, England's economic heartland, the people in this room, to bring together the data that's needed to help people understand what their carbon footprint is, so that they can make informed choices the same time as therefore improving the system for people, so that people can get about and they have less access issues, but also if they are going to take a car or a plane rather than a train, they're making that choice knowing what their carbon footprint is. And I don't believe there's anything out there at the moment that brings all that together for people. And we should work on that and do it for our area as a pilot project.
Scott, sounds like a job for academia, isn't it?
Well, hopefully I've given you a very quick, in 5 minutes, an idea of how we are working with the Heartland, also the Department of Transport. I'm actually, although I sound like probably quite a miserable so-and-so on here, I admit, I'm actually quite positive. My remit is, look, I want to bring the younger voice who are actually living in this technological digital revolution. They know what they want. We need to work with them. They need to get their voice heard, up to politicians, so we can start to create a world actually where they can come actually get jobs, green jobs, or whatever you want to call them, sustainable jobs. So I think as a university, hopefully we're beginning to facilitate that.
You can work with the technology cluster at Silverstone, maybe.
We work with anyone, so there we go.
Sylvia, do you want to, and Andrew, yeah.
I think one point to make is that authorities and regional bodies have a big role to play in raising awareness among people of the issues that we're all facing in transport. So I speak to mums on the school gate, and many of them are not aware of how bad it is to keep your engine idling and how much pollution that produces and how harmful that is to their children's health. There is no awareness out there, and local authorities need to address this, as well as making the bold decisions on issues like clean air zones and school streets, and explaining to residents why this is important to their health and for the planet.
Okay. Any more points for the Lucy? Have you got any more questions? Yes.
Yeah, I think one of the big things we can do here today is recognise this huge disconnect between wanting to do something about the climate emergency and actually doing it. And this concept of, and I agree with what was said about, we always need this concept of decarbonise me. And that is actually something we're looking at in Oxfordshire at the moment, about how do we get that message across. It's not about what everyone else does, it's about what are you doing to try and achieve the outcomes that we need in our towns and cities. Because without getting that message across, I agree with everybody, this is all going to be in vain. And even yesterday, we had this fantastic Road to Renewables bus going from London to Glasgow as part of COP26. We hosted it in Oxford, showcased all the good work that we were doing in Oxfordshire. But a lot of people who were involved in that trip drove to park in Broad Street, one of the most sensitive parts of the city, and in their 4x4s. And there's a complete disconnect between positive messaging and wanting to do things and what people are actually doing in practice. And that's a big challenge that we all need to solve.
Andrew.
I wanted to mention something that hasn't come up this morning so far. What happens at the end of life? What happens at the end of use of things? If we can move to a scenario where we're actually more restorative, more regenerative by design, the job creation that is driven by a move to a circular economy, getting these resources back again and then reprocessing and reuse them, is entirely aligned with the objectives of the Heartland. And you know, if I bring in a container of goods, I may well have one individual moving that container from the crane. It'll have a crew of 13 on the boat. Could have 110,000 pairs of shoes in there. Getting one pair of shoes back from a consumer, reassessed, resorted, I could have 3-4 jobs in there. So let's not leave out the road to circularity and the road to reuse, because that is definitely something where we can engage with the community, can recover resources, can be more resource efficient, can provide those return loads that people did have there was an unanswered question about empty running, but we can actually look at rebalancing some of the flows. When you do that, you perform a much better, more balanced solution with quite strong job creation. The last report I saw was 600,000 jobs in the UK from the adoption of a circular economy.
Any final points anyone wants to make for the panel? Yes? No? Great. Look, well, thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed it. We're just about a little bit over and into your lunchtime. And thanks for bearing with us there. But thanks very much to Andrew, to Silvia, and to Scott for setting out their cases. Very interesting. Round of applause for our speakers. And thank you to James, to Roz, to Lucy, and to Phil for putting the questions there. Excellent. Good job. Round of applause.